Okay, and I'll mute myself.
Now let's get my slides ready there. There we go.
Okay.
Will I kick off?
Yeah, we can see your slides. I'll briefly introduce you, Gillian, and then I'll leave the stage for you. So hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you, meanwhile, people still join. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to Dr. Gillian Murphy. Gillian is a lecturer in cognitive psychology at the School of Applied Psychology in University College Cork. Her research primarily focuses on memory and attention, and currently she's investigating issues such as memory distortion, fake news, conspiracy theories, and deepfakes. Today, she's going to talk about this latter aspect in particular, more precisely the effects that deepfake videos have on memory and the problems they pose for education and interventions. So thank you very much, Gillian, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for having me, everyone, and for your patience. I know you got onto me months ago, and I literally came back from maternity leave last week, so I'm definitely rusty, and forgive any pauses while I'm figuring things out. But it's lovely to speak to you. So yeah, I suppose I'm going to talk about deepfakes and. I think me and the people I work with, we've been on maybe a bit of a journey with how we think about deepfakes and how we're approaching them in our research. And I hope I'll take you on the journey with me here, maybe give you a bit of background to what we've been doing. So when I say we, always a group of people, and none of this is me on my own. Connor from UCC with me, and then Mike, who is in UL, Matthew, who's based up in Edinburgh, and then two wonderful PhD students, John and Didier. So none of this is mine alone. So I'm mostly going to talk to you today about false memories. A lot of my research is in the area of false memories. And I think it's good to kick off by saying that false memories are normal, they're expected, they're part of a perfectly functioning, adaptive memory system, nothing to worry about, everyone gets them. Everyone is susceptible, there's nothing, sometimes we think these are issues that happen to other people. There's no evidence that some of us are more susceptible in certain situations, as I'm going to talk about, but everyone gets them. And so a lot of my research, I would kind of be grounding it in the source monitoring framework, which is one of many models of memory that we can use to understand false memories. But I'm going to kind of base what we're talking about today in that. So as a whistle-stop tour of the source monitoring framework, the idea is that every time you conjure a sort of mental experience in your mind, you undergo two series of kind of rapid judgments about that mental image or experience that help you decide kind of where that image has come from, whether it comes from memory or imagination or television or something like that. And so the two judgments are heuristic and systematic. Heuristic is you kind of saying, is this vivid? Is it familiar? Is it detailed? Is it easy to conjure? So, you might sum that up as, does it feel like a memory? Basically, you're kind of asking yourself. And then systematic is it plausible? Is it in line with prior knowledge? So I would call that kind of, does that fit with what I know about the world, basically? And so a lot of the research that I've been doing I've been looking at ways in which you might bias either one of these judgments and how situations or individual differences might bias one of those judgments and therefore increase your odds of developing a false memory for any given topic, often misinformation, fake news, that kind of thing. So you could bias the heuristic judgment by simply exposing people to the information multiple times. That will make them process it more fluently. It'll be easier to process and will make it feel more like a memory. And you might bias the systematic judgment in a situation where people encounter information that is in line with their existing political beliefs. So we've done loads of studies on this, showing that if you encounter misinformation that is in line with your existing beliefs, so say you voted yes to Brexit and you encounter misinformation that makes the so you voted leave. If you encounter misinformation that makes the Remain side look bad, you're more susceptible to it than someone who is already on the other side of that vote. So we've done studies on this with, Brexit, the abortion referendum in Ireland, COVID, all sorts of things like that. It's a neat and reliable effect. But there's other ways in which we can bias these judgments. And just to give you an example of I suppose the kind of methodology here before I get into deepfakes. One way in which we could bias the heuristic judgment, so that's that question of does this feel like a memory, is through push polls. So push polling is a kind of dirty trick in politics, I suppose. And it's where, you know, a normal political poll, the aim is to gather opinion, but the aim of a push poll is to give you information. It's completely the opposite. So John McCain was the victim of a kind of very famous push poll during the Democratic nomination run against George W. Bush, so a long time ago now. And he's written in his own kind of memoirs that he thinks this may have cost him that vote, actually. And people started receiving calls, you know, in these particular counties and particular swing states saying, would you be more or less likely to vote for John McCain if you knew that he had an illegitimate Black child? And himself and his wife had adopted a child around that time. And so there was enough of a suspicion of truth in that, and it was just designed to plant that information in voters' minds. Obviously, the Bush campaign denied that they ever did this, and who knows, I'm not a historian in terms of figuring out if that really happened, but that's the idea of push polls. And so we were interested in whether push polls might work in some way by biasing that heuristic judgment for memory, in that we ran a kind of a series of studies. I'm just going to give you one example here where people thought they were just being questioned about various political issues. We did lots of different topics, lots of different politicians. One of them was about American politics. And we said, would you be more or less supportive of Donald Trump if you heard that before becoming president, he would volunteer at a New York homeless shelter, helping to prepare meals behind the scenes? And this is a positive push poll, which is, like I say, push polls are really more of a mudslinging exercise. They tend to be negative, but in the study we did positive and negative ones. And so people answered this question in with other hypothetical questions. They did lots of different tasks. And then either, you know, a few minutes later, a few days later, or up to, I think, 10 days later, depending on the conditions, we then gave them some news stories. And we said, oh, we're just interested in your memories of these news stories and what you remember. And one of the news stories, mixed in with all the rest of them, perfectly matched the push poll. So this is the exact same story, saying that Donald Trump was praised that he quietly volunteered at a homeless shelter and then had to relinquish it when he became president. Now you might be thinking this story seems very unlikely to be true. Obviously, it's completely fake. None of this is true. And it is. It's not very plausible. It doesn't chime with his character, the idea that he would kind of quietly do something like this. And so in the I hope you can see this here now, in the false memory rate in the control group, I'm going to move my fingers, I'm covering up my corner. In the control group, the false memory rate was 1%. So 1% of people said that they remembered that this actually happened. They remembered reading this in the news and they think it really happened. But then amongst people who had seen the push poll up to 10 days earlier, the false memory rate was 17%. So really, really effective. Just by answering this hypothetical question, people became really susceptible to forming false memories for things that aren't true. And so we're interpreting this as kind of having an effect on that heuristic judgment. So in answering a question like, how would you feel if this were true? You're having to imagine a world in which that is true, and you're having to engage in a bit of imagination and a bit of hypothetical thinking, and that the act of doing that is creating a mental image, so that then later when you revisit this story and you come to conjure this up again, it feels familiar, it feels easy to recall, it feels more vivid. And you therefore mistakenly ascribe that experience to memory. That's kind of the idea of what's going on there. And, you know, this was a long paper that we did lots of different kind of probes and conditions trying to see if people were maybe misreporting this as like, I remember this from your survey. They weren't. We tried to see if people knew what we were at. They hadn't a clue. I think it's really quite an insidious way in which people can kind of increase the plausibility or the acceptance of misinformation, is by, you know, I'm just asking a question, I'm not doing anything, and it can actually be very effective. So that's all kind of background to say these were the things I was interested in. And then deepfakes came along. So deepfakes, you know, first appeared on the internet in 2017 in kind of pornography threads on Reddit. And I was in California visiting Elizabeth Loftus. We were working on one of these projects, and while I was in her office, she got a call from Vox.com, who were writing this article that, you know, announced that deepfakes are coming for your memories, and they were kind of writing it about what might happen to our notion of history and evidence and all of these things once deepfakes came along. And they sent a deepfake for her to watch, and I watched it with her, and we both said, oh my goodness, this is terrifying in terms of what it might do. And it was funny to go back and look at it now, because it's like a time-stamped pre-registration of what we thought was going to happen before we got into any of these deepfake studies, where and I'm not just landing Beth in this, I absolutely agreed, you know, our both of us and a lot of other people felt that deepfakes would be really, really powerful, in that, in the same way as a push-pull or repeated exposure, you know, you would be providing people with this really concrete, vivid image of this thing that you're alleging happened. And that's going to absolutely knock the legs out from under that heuristic judgment, and they're going to fall for misinformation and form false memories at a much higher rate. That is what we expected going into this, very much. And there was reason for us to believe that, I suppose. You know, some very famous studies in cognitive psychology, including, you know, the study here from Kim Wade. Sorry, I'm trying to drag around my box but I can see the bottom of the slide. This study here from Kim Wade on doctored images. It's a really famous study. It's in, you know, your first year cognitive psychology textbooks often will have this. And they got people to enroll in the study, gave them, they got a childhood image from people's parents, and then doctored the image to put them in a hot air balloon. And none of these people had ever been in a hot air balloon as children, but presenting them with this image and talking about it led to, you know, 50% of them formed a false memory that they actually had been in a hot air balloon as children. And so I suppose that this is where our expectations were coming from. It was that there's this evidence that this can happen with doctored media, and, you know, all of this knowledge of the source monitoring framework. So I'm going to talk through maybe one of the studies that we've done on this, on deepfakes and false memories, as they all have similar findings. So I'll just go through one of them here in detail. This was a paper called "Changing the Face of Movies with Deepfakes," and it was about false memories for movie remakes. And you might be wondering why we chose that topic. It seems a bit random. And the truth of it is that at the time, this is before we got the kind of big grant that we're working on now, and we just didn't have the technical capacity or just the ability to make really good deepfakes. They're kind of harder than you might think. You know, they're tricky to make, and this was a couple of years ago. And so we kind of looked at the internet, looked at existing deepfakes, and there are Reddit communities dedicated to just posting. There's one called Deepfakes That Are Safe for Work, separated from all the pornography ones on Reddit. And there's a thriving community there of people who Photoshop other celebrities into movies. It's just a hobby for people. It's just for fun, but they're excellent. They're such good quality. People are putting loads of time into them. So we thought we'd take advantage of those. And we gathered them up. And our question was, like, can viewing deepfakes lead to false memories for movies that don't exist? And then crucially, are deepfakes any more effective than text at doing that? Because that really is the claim with deepfakes, that they're going to do something that is over and above what existing forms of misinformation can do. So when participants enrolled, they were told this is a study of movie remakes and how they are perceived. That's what they thought they were looking at. And they were asked questions after they saw each movie, like, have you seen this remake? Was it better than the original? Did you see it in the cinema, or did you see it at home? That kind of thing. And so some of the movies that they saw were just as text. Basically, there's two conditions. I'll get into it now in a second. And they saw it either as text or as a film clip. And some of them were real, and some of them were ones that we made up. So if it was like text, it would be like this. It was just a description underneath of, this is the year it came out, and here's a picture of that movie. Other ones were shown as actual movie clips. I hope this will work. So that's Indiana Jones. That wasn't real. This one isn't real either.
You come in here and interrupt me. You're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me. And it will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
Yeah.
Fine.
There's The Shining, also not real. And this is The Matrix. Right, so you get the idea. So you can see why we chose movies. I could confidently say these are better quality than what I would have made a few years ago on my laptop. So in this experiment, all participants saw 2 fake and 4 real film remakes. So the fake ones, as you saw there, were The Shining, The Matrix, Captain Marvel, and Indiana Jones. And the real ones, these are movies that have really been remade in recent years, were Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Total Recall, Carrie, and Tomb Raider. And they were shown as text only or text with a clip with them. And we debrief people afterwards in line with kind of best practice, which I'm going to get to later in the talk. So on this graph that I'm going to show you, on the y-axis, you have the percentage of people who formed a false memory for that particular movie remake. On the x-axis, then you've got each film, and you've got whether it was shown as a deepfake or text, and you've got the 4 films along the bottom. So really what we assumed would happen is that, well, actually, I'll just show you. It's a very easy to interpret graph here, and there is no difference between the deepfakes and the text. Oh, and I didn't mention the color scheme. So it's broken up into basically the degree of people's memories, whether they said they had seen the full film, whether they said they had just seen clips or trailers of it, whether or not they said they just heard of it, kind of separate to the point here. But no matter what way we looked at it and all the different pre-registered ways, it didn't matter. So deepfakes worked exactly the same as text. So whether I told you that Will Smith starred in a remake of The Matrix and then asked you, had you seen it, or I actually showed you Will Smith in a remake of The Matrix, there was no difference in terms of the false memory rate. And we've shown this kind of elsewhere. I'm not going to go through it, but there's another study here that used other ones. It was a deepfake of Kim Kardashian and some other kind of celebrity ones. No difference. We have political ones ongoing at the moment, not really seeing a difference in any of them yet either. And so why? Like the question you're kind of left with, I think it's surprising to most of us. I think your gut would suggest that seeing it should do something more than just hearing about it. So, we're kind of forced to conclude that the text-based misinformation can lead to equally powerful source monitoring errors. And when you go back to the literature, what's really interesting is that Marianne Gary and Kim Wade replicated that hot air balloon study 3 years after the famous original one. But this time they had 2 conditions, one with doctored photos and one with just a simple narrative, just simple text. And they replicated the finding of with the doctored photos, very effective, 50% false memory rate. But unexpectedly, they found just telling people a story gave them an 83% false memory rate. So that's just telling you, when you were 5, you went in a hot air balloon, you were wearing a red coat, like just telling them a little story, not very long, was even more effective than using doctored photos. And I suppose it underscores that most classic misinformation effect studies, they are just text. The foundation on which this field is built is not smoke and mirrors of visual effects. It is just simple text, really, all of them. And so Gary and Wade offer an account or an explanation of this that's grounded in processing fluency. So just the idea that when I tell you about Will Smith in The Matrix, or when you're told about a hot air balloon ride, that you have to build an image for yourself, and you have to kind of construct that. And the idea is that maybe the act of constructing that, the effortfulness of it, leads that information to be processed more fluently when you then come to evaluate it later. That there's maybe shallower engagement with just viewing a text or viewing an image, or viewing a deepfake, than if you kind of build that material for yourself mentally. And there's kind of converging evidence that supports this, but no direct evidence yet. I think it's a really interesting question. It's a question that's still outstanding. And when I went back to look at them, that follow-up study has 30% of the citations of the original study, even though I think it adds a lot to our understanding of that original study. It's I think something that becomes really clear when you kind of dig into deepfake literature and literature around this is how appealing kind of technophobic narratives can be, and how they just make more of a splash than anything else, And so I think my conclusions around that would be that deepfakes are powerful at implanting misinformation. Like, it worked. Like, we had good rates of people saying, I remember seeing this Will Smith movie that doesn't exist. It's not that the deepfakes didn't work, it's that text worked just as well. And there's a difference between those 2 conclusions. And so we talk a lot about deepfakes being harmful because of the ways in which they're going to swindle people, and that is different to what's come before. But I suppose I'm kind of coming to the perspective that other harms of deepfakes might actually be worse than their direct kind of manipulative effects. And we see loads of these in public life and in the news. There was a minor scandal in Ireland there a couple of years ago where our Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, there's a really grainy TikTok video going around of him kissing someone in a nightclub that wasn't his husband, and all kinds of it was posted online, and it kind of made some news sites as kind of a scandal, a political scandal, I suppose. But instantly on Twitter, you had people saying, that's probably a deep fake. I think that's a deep fake. Who made that? Is it a deep fake? And I don't know whether or not it was a deep fake, but I don't think it was, based on the way that he responded to the matter. He never mentioned that any of it was fake, but it was kind of perfect fodder for it. It was a grainy video. It was scandalous. It was salacious, and instantly into the online discourse, it comes people, I suppose, often you have people with an understanding of deepfakes that's probably this deep, but it's just enough to be able to say that's not real. And that's quite a powerful thing, and closer to home for you guys. There's a lot of that going around at the moment. I made the mistake of reading a few articles about Kate Middleton. As I say, I've been on maternity leave. And when I open Twitter now, I am bombarded with the maddest conspiracy theories you've ever read. It's all, and then I make the mistake of clicking on them because I think they're interesting, and I'm in it now. I'm in the algorithm, and it's all that I ever see. But a lot of them are grounded again in this, just a little bit of knowledge about deepfakes, just enough to be able to say, I don't believe what's in front of my eyes. And you see how dangerous it is. And so one of the studies from our group was looking at posts on Twitter around deepfakes in the war in Ukraine. And this was the first study really of wartime deepfakes. And people have long said that, wars where deepfakes could cause a lot of harm. And with the supposition, I suppose, that they will be very serious deepfakes, and that's what will cause harm. And actually, most of them were very unserious. It was photoshopping Putin into movies and that kind of thing. Like, the vast percentage of them were very silly or were meant to be fake, But the kind of primary finding is that real media was labeled as deepfakes more often than deepfakes were actually identified. And it kind of underlines the risks here of education and of pre-bunking and other approaches that I suppose we might think should work with deepfakes are kind of, they present problems. And one of them, like there's a GIF here showing a deepfake that was made by the Ukrainian government, and it's Putin walking around Kiev and he's saying, look what I've done, I'm a terrorist, and this kind of thing. And it's really good quality, it's a great video, and it was obviously made as propaganda, but also made to kind of forewarn people against Russian disinformation that might be coming out. And there was this wasn't an experiment, this is tentative conclusions, but there seemed to be a bit of a backfire effect where lots of people said, well, hold on, if you can make this and it's this good, how should we trust any of the war footage that's coming out of Ukraine? Like, how do I know all of that is a deepfake too? And you create a suspicion of media that might be difficult if you don't follow up on that. If you just say, a very well-intended campaign designed to increase awareness of deepfakes could possibly do a lot of harm. And that would be the kind of primary take-home message of this research, is that we need better evidence on deepfake harms. We need to separate out the evidence from dystopian fears that are very common around, what deepfakes might be doing. And most of what I've talked about here is experiments we've done that just relate to memory. There are other ways in which deepfakes might be more powerful than other forms of misinformation. They might be more likely to go viral. They might be more likely to sway people's beliefs or something like that. But you want to rein in the very alarmist discourse. So one of my students, Didier, has done a systematic review looking at studies that looked at deepfakes effects on beliefs, memories, and attitudes. And really surprisingly, the majority of them included no comparator. So they just they did a study where they would show someone a deepfake and then say, it's a deepfake of Joe Biden saying something awful. And then they say afterwards, people like Joe Biden less. And then the headlines are all, look what deepfakes can do to politics. They're so dangerous. And there's no comparator. The implication of those studies is that deepfakes are doing something new, but it's not always clear that they actually are. You know, there's a real lack of methodological rigor in some of the studies in this area. And also, you know, I think a lot of psychologists who are interested in these questions, they need to pair up with people with the technical skills to make a good deepfakes, or they need to be able to afford to hire people to do those, because again, most of these studies didn't have custom-made deepfakes. You know, they're difficult, and then you're working with things that aren't ideal, I suppose. But I think the other thing is that no matter what you do in your own research, sometimes the coverage of the research can be maybe not what you intended. So our own study that I mentioned there about deepfakes and movies, the actual coverage of it, though the title, the abstract, all of it is about how they didn't work any more than text. The coverage is deepfakes are going to fill our brains with false memories. Deepfakes are an easy way to make people remember events that never happened. Like I said, there's an appetite for technophobic kind of coverage that suggests that deepfakes are doing something new. And it's one of those things that once you realize it, you do kind of see it everywhere, that a lot of those claims are not built on strong evidence yet. We just don't have it. And so, like I mentioned, there's this tightrope of deepfake interventions where, you know, even with training, people are not very good at identifying deepfakes. You could really train people, and they're hard to spot. That's the whole point. It's difficult to spot them. And I saw the preprint from your group showing a continued influence even after you debunk people. So we have limited evidence that we can do much in terms of, you know, we can raise awareness, we can tell people about them, but does that change anything? Maybe we don't know yet that it does. But what we do know is that when people know about deepfakes, there is this kind of epistemic pollution, you could call it, where they become suspicious of real media. And so we have a study, it's nearly finished now, where we gave people a nice little active, you know, engaging education task to do with deepfakes. And then we tested how they engaged with some media afterwards. And they became a little bit better at spotting deepfakes, but they also became a little bit more suspicious of real media and less willing to accept it. And, you know, you can kind of make the mistake of thinking those two things cancel each other out. But you know, the information ecosystem is not equal parts deepfakes and real media. So you know, most of the media people encounter is not fake. So, you know, potentially you're doing a lot of net harm with these interventions if you make a small improvement to their ability to detect something that they encounter very rarely, but you also disimprove their ability to accept information that they're going to see much more regularly. And I don't know, I think I'm starting to come around to much bigger questions of kind of what gives us the right to run these interventions when we might cause so much harm with them, and how do we design them in a way that's fair, and maybe participatory approaches would be better. You know, I think there's a lot of ethical questions around how we're doing this and how we move forward, and not just assuming that all interventions might be good interventions. And so the other part to this then is ethics. So I'm really interested in ethical practices in misinformation research. And how, I suppose, particularly because I study false memories, you know, I would often say a few years ago have gotten questions at the end of my talk saying, did you leave people with these false memories? Did people really leave your study believing Donald Trump volunteered in a homeless shelter? And I would say, oh no, I debriefed them. And then people would say, well, did it work? Do you know if it worked? So I've started adding studies onto my studies where I follow people up afterwards and I check. And we call it, you know, putting people back the way that we found them. It's like the wording we use, or unringing the bell, like how effectively did we undo it? And most of it is very promising. You find that they do work. You know, you can undo this if you do it properly and all of that. But because I'm interested in that and I'm sensitive to it, I find that now when I get asked to review deepfake papers, it alarms me how many papers make no mention of ethics. Most of them don't have an ethics section at all. And there's a paradox there where the whole introduction will be about how terrible deepfakes are and how dangerous they are and all these harms they might have. And then the method section will be, and then we made a deepfake of this sitting politician. We showed it to 1,000 people during an election, and oh, here's how it worked or it didn't work. And there's never a mention of taking that back or how you took it back or anything like that. And I think it's a real problem, especially with deepfakes. You know that you just have to be mindful of what you're doing. And I think particularly when it comes to reporting these things, that we need to improve. And so we did a big scoping review a couple of years ago of ethical practices in misinformation research. So it was papers published between 2016 and 2021, and we ended up with 346 papers altogether. So these were papers where people presented misinformation in the study that was of some real world consequence. So not his jacket was blue instead of his jacket was red. It was, you know, vaccines, climate change, politics, that kind of thing. And this was a big study looking at kind of ethical practices and reporting of ethics. But I'll just boil it down to like 2 questions I'm going to draw your attention to. So I wonder if you could think for yourself, how many you think would mention debriefing at all? Like, and I mean, we interpreted this as generously as possible, any mention of maybe in the procedure, just and then they were debriefed, or you know, ideally a whole ethics section explaining how they debriefed them. And the number was much smaller than we imagined. Only 27% of all those papers mentioned the word debriefing at all. And I include myself in this. I'm not saying I'm any better than any of these researchers. I think these are norms that we've all gotten used to as authors, as reviewers, as editors. We've become used to this. And then we looked at what percentage of papers reported any indication of debriefing effectiveness. So this is, you know, following up. So even just asking people afterwards, like, did you understand the debrief? Or can you tell me which stories were fake after I've debriefed you? Or in our memory studies, you know, sometimes we'll follow people up a week later, or we've done up to 6 months later, where we show them new, you know, a bunch of new stories and the old stories, and we see, did, you know, has having been in our studies left them worse off than someone who is not? You know, are they more susceptible to this story again? So again, we interpreted this very broadly, and we just said, what percentage of papers reported any indication that their debriefing was effective? And it was 0.29% of these papers. And so, like, for all of these questions, we also followed up. We contacted authors and said, you know, were there practices that didn't appear in the paper, but you actually did do them? And, you know, those numbers went up amongst the people who responded to the surveys, but I'm nowhere close to 100% for any of those things. And so this is a problem, I think, across all misinformation research, but I think there's something about deepfakes and the way, you know, in running the study and debriefing people, you're teaching them about deepfakes, you're possibly introducing all this epistemic pollution, and you're possibly introducing powerful misinformation. And ethics should be maybe a bit more front and center than it is. I think it's something to be really mindful of if you're doing research in this area. So on that very cheery note, I'll wrap up, and happy to chat or answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Gillian. That was indeed interesting, well, not only because you talked about the dangers of deepfakes themselves, but also about the dangers of interventions about that. And it's a very, well, I would say kind of a different point of view, but it's something that we have to reflect on. So let's see if we have any questions, because we do have time for that. Christoph. And Steve.
Yes. Thank you so much. It was a super interesting talk. Regarding the comparison of movies, if I remember correctly, the one of the movies, I think it was Captain Marvel, was the difference was less intense, right? Could that be attributable to the more recent publication of that movie compared to the other ones? I think none of that was earlier than the early 2000s, I guess.
Yeah, it wasn't that there was still no difference between deepfakes and text. There was just altogether more acceptance of that story as being true, and we don't really know exactly why that was. Like I suppose we think it's probably some combination of recency, like you said, but also, I don't know, there's a general sense, for me anyway, I'm not a Marvel movie person, but they're just everywhere. And I think there's a sense of like, sure, that could have been one of them. I think there's a general, and also I suppose because there are so many Marvel movies and so much media coverage of them, I do think people have more kind of raw materials with which to build a memory. You know, they have more resources, and that they're more likely to actually make a source monitoring error in that regard. So we didn't set out to compare the movies. You know, we plan to just collapse them all down. But I suspect that's what's going on. But I suppose either way, regardless of the baseline plausibility of the fake story, we're still seeing no difference between deepfakes and text. Yeah, it's
I
just
was
a
just
weird.
interested in the difference between, like, because it was rather stark, I thought.
Yeah, it's a weird, quirky result. And to be honest, I think the Captain Marvel one was weird because I did this project with students initially. The data gathering that I did was part of a student project, part of something I was teaching, and I sent the students off to sorry, I don't know if you can see that flickering. I sent the students off to find their oops, sorry, it's my PowerPoint opening back up. I sent students off to find the videos, and then we had a class vote on which were the best deepfakes. You know, we had lots of them. And initially when students came back, all of them had male actors. And I said, oh, go and find some with women in them. And it was a huge mistake because you cannot type a woman's name into the internet with the word deepfake after it and get anything other than pornography. It's impossible. And so we do have some other research going on that. You know, sometimes I do feel that you're ignoring the elephant in the room when you do research on deepfakes that is not related to pornography, because estimates are that something like 96% of deepfakes on the internet are pornography. And, you know, all of that is women, almost all of it is non-consensual. It's a huge problem in and of itself. And a lot of it, I suppose some people would argue that the focus on that, it's just kind of swept under the rug. And instead it's like, but how will this affect politicians? And it is affecting a lot of people already, but it's a methodological issue, I think, for a lot of people, that it's hard to study existing deepfakes because it's just males that are in them. So I think we knew going into it the Captain Marvel one wasn't brilliant, but it was very hard actually to find anything else because it's just all pornography, unfortunately.
Thank you.
More depressing follow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much. Very, very interesting. And I have a few questions and comments. I mean, first of all, the debriefing angle, I think that's a very important thing to study. Certainly from my point of view, as far as I know, we always pay pretty careful attention to debriefing. But we haven't done much by way of a follow-up of the effectiveness, admitted. However, Uli Ecker has a paper out on the, are you familiar with that paper on the ethics?
Yeah, he's actually a co-author on that scoping review.
Oh, okay. Well, here we are, small world. Very good. So at least, okay, and he'll tap me on the shoulder if I screw up. That's good. Now, on the debriefing though, one consideration that I always have is, in my experience, by and large, people don't read anything. Okay, as a rule of thumb, they don't, if they come to an experiment. And the more you throw at them to read, the less they're actually going to read it. You know, they'll just click through it. And so what we've been doing recently, actually, I have some sort of data on that. And in fact, Christoph, you were part of this, where we try to simplify the consent procedure, right? It wasn't on the debriefing end, but in the consent end, by making it so succinct that people had just enough information to make a decision, but no more than that. But we had a button that said, show me the fine print. Yeah. And that made a huge difference to our retention and recruitment rate in a complicated experiment where they had to do other stuff, compared to a more extensive recruitment message. So, and I suspect the same may apply to debriefing. I suspect that sometimes less may be a hell of a lot more because people will at least read it. And it would be a lovely project actually to explore that. And I mean, we have data in a quasi comparison between different studies for the consent end. We haven't done it for the debriefing, but it's probably something somebody should do this.
Yeah, we've done a few of them, and none of them are published yet, but I've become a big advocate for it because it's so easy. You're debriefing people anyway, and it's tacking on a little bit, you know, to your plan. And I would usually pre-register it as a separate thing. And we've done a couple. You know, I think our favorite approach now would be giving people a little quiz. You know, you might tell them, so we just, as you say, keep the text to a minimum, and we pop up the story or the headline, big picture, maybe with a big red X through it, saying this was fake, we made it up, and then we might give them a quiz where they have to pick which one was fake or something. We try some kind of active engagement, because I mean, we're all the same. You get a big long page and you're just not going to read it, you know.
Exactly.
So but
Yeah.
we've done a few comparisons of kind of active versus passive methods of debriefing, and we're not really seeing a big difference between them. I think it's more of a gut feeling that it's probably more pleasant. But yeah, I think there's it's I suppose for something that presumably all of us do at the end of our experiments, there's not as much literature on it that I think as you would expect. It's something that when you pay attention to it, you realize there's kind of a lot we could be doing, I think.
Okay, good. Then maybe two more things, if you don't mind. One thing is about your comment that interventions can do more harm than good if they make people more skeptical, and then you get this seemingly paradoxical situation where they identify more real videos as fake than they detect fake videos. And, you know, I have no doubt that that is true. Now, there are two things to consider in this. The first question that arises is, okay, so what are you going to do? Are you suggesting, oh, let's not tell people there are deepfakes out there, so they become even more susceptible to them? Or what's the alternative? And that then leads me to the second question that, I mean, if all you're doing is to warn people about deepfakes without enhancing their skill at differentiating, well, then what do you expect? You know, so it's, to me, it's a real dilemma, and so I think it's worth considering what the alternatives would be. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, absolutely. And I think there can be a weird tendency, and I've seen it in some papers where, you know, people highlight this paradox, and there's like an unsaid assumption with like, it's almost like they're concluding, well, don't tell anyone about deepfakes. Let's keep it under wraps, which is so ridiculous and unscalable. People are going to know about them. People already know about them. I agree with you. I think some of it is around teaching skills, like you say, and it's not all that dissimilar to the skills we would teach for other forms of misinformation. But
Exactly,
I think
where pre-bunking is very successful.
exactly, but not so much founded in, you know, I suppose there was a push initially, particularly if you look at the technical side of deepfake identification, and there was a lot of people called it a bit of an arms race of, you know, initially it was like, oh, the blink rate is off and things like that, and then the software just improves and it's getting better and better, and I'm skeptical that there's anything we can teach people that is going to let a human being glance at it and say that's a deepfake, right? So I think it's probably around teaching people like boring things. It's media literacy, it's critical thinking, it's teaching people to seek things out and verify and all of the normal boring effective things, I think. But I think there's a so the answer coming out of this is about, I suppose, not to be so focused on we'll just tell people about deepfakes and that's going to fix everything, and instead it's about those kind of broader solutions. Like we have one of my other students is on a project looking at conspiracy theories and combating conspiracy theories, and one of the ways we're going about it is developing a video game that teaches critical thinking skills and critical thinking about conspiracies specifically. And they, you know, something like that where you're teaching people skills that are transferable and applicable and will apply to, you know, I suppose deepfakes are the current thing du jour, but there'll be another form of this, and there are other forms of it, and I don't really think any of the solutions need to be so narrow that they're only about deepfakes. They're broader.
Yeah, and that, I guess, segues into the last point I was interested in. One of the things in your first study about the movies is that it seems to me that all the questions were fairly generic about, have you seen this clip? Did you see the movie? Have you heard of the remake? And you found that the video was no different from the text. But, and that's, you know, remarkable in itself, very interesting result. But I wonder what would happen if you actually dug into the message a bit more and found, sort of tested people's memory for what was actually said in the movie or the implications of what they watched. Because in reality, if you're worried about deepfakes, it's about the content that, somebody creates a deepfake of a politician saying something that they didn't say. And that to me is problematic, but that's very different from identifying how people fall for that than it is to talk about, have you seen that movie? So I wonder if you have any data along those lines or
Not
anything.
yet. So it took us a long time to, we have one just starting now on deepfakes in the American election. And so I suppose all of these were kind of, these other studies we've done are nearly testing the waters for this bigger study for exactly those reasons. I suspect some of the ways in which deepfakes might have an advantage is that I think the effects might last longer, but also my big suspicion is that it might be more shareable than a news article. And that's difficult to study in a nice, ecologically valid way. But, we're just about to start a series of studies and also looking at just the long-term effects of it. Like all of these studies are just asking people immediately, and I wonder if people see it and then you leave them a few weeks, will having seen the deepfake actually confer some benefit. I think it's probably a few different ways of looking at it, but I don't know. I do think some of it might be the way that people share and spread videos around on WhatsApp. Like when I think of misinformation and how it spreads, in some ways we're limited when we just look at it on an online survey, where I've never seen a method for replicating that I think exactly gets to probably what is the nub of the problem. But like I say, you can't go making, we're not going to make a deepfake of Trump and then release it into WhatsApp and see what happens. So yeah, I think it's probably about incremental study of these things, so that you can gather a full picture of it. But yeah, who knows? Hopefully in a few months we'll have some answers on it in America at least. Great.
We have a few minutes left. I have a curiosity, Gillian. When you talked about the push-pulls studies, like you showed that increase in the sort of false memories, and does that increase interact with either politicians, like the politicians included in the story, or with the participants' partisanship? Like if I'm a Democrat, I tend more to believe that, or vice versa, something like that.
I'm struggling to remember. I don't think I think probably with the partisanship, we saw independent effects, but not interactions, if you know what I mean. So just the expected. We also did other topics, like there was one, we did some on politicians. We included the Pope for one of them. We picked a couple of different public figures and different kinds of, positive, negative, different kind of time lengths. But no, I don't think there was anything beyond that. It seemed to be an effect that basically worked for everyone. Like the stories really differed in their baseline plausibility as well, massively. That where things were coming up and down from, but consistent across all of them was that having seen a push-pull had this effect in the average, obviously not for everyone.
Okay, that's interesting because it leads to one of the first slides that you show where a false memory has to touch on like two dimensions, which is plausibility, right? And so if the effect is the same, it's interesting indeed.
Yeah.
There is a comment from Constance, who's unfortunately is in a train, but it might be worth to read it. Like it's probably mentioning what you were talking about in the last slide about epistemic pollution. So politicians say, "Hey, that's a deep fake," when it's actually not. Like, and so information loses its value. Like, I don't know if you have a brief comment on that before we probably close.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think that is like we say, that is, I think possibly that's the real novelty with deepfakes. I think everything else you can say is I suppose even that it's all incremental. I find as a research group, given that we're working on deepfakes for a few years now, I feel nearly every project that we do, we end up back at the question of in what way is this novel? In what way are deepfakes different to something else? We come back to that a lot, and I don't know that we have a satisfactory answer, but it's I suppose we're more seeing that it's an incremental push on things that have come before, and in this way too. Like politicians or anyone have always been able to say that's not true or that's fake news. And now you can also say that's a deep fake. You know, it is just a push on something that has come before, but I think one that can be very damaging, obviously, because it's getting to the heart of what evidence is. Like, these are enormous questions.
Well,
I'm gonna have to go. Sorry, guys. Very nice.
No problem.
I'm giving a talk in a few minutes and need to prepare. So
No problem. Bye.
see you later.
yeah, Steve. So if there aren't any more questions, maybe we can end this talk here. So I want to thank you very much, Gillian, for this talk. It was amazing. And again, if you want to keep in touch, just drop me an email. I can add you to the mailing list. And thank you everyone else who attended. And I'll see you next week with our last talk of the year, well, the academic year at least. Okay, see you. Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.